Hello everybody and welcome back to ChessDiagnostic. Today we're going to look at a game between Mikhail Tal and Spiridinov. First we're going to look at this position, and I'm going to be talking about are pawns the soul of chess? And I would actually say that piece activity is the soul of chess, but we're also going to talk about the function of pawns, especially in the middle game. Now, I would like to actually read a quote by Artur Yusupov from his amazing book series, Build Up Your Chess. And in chapter 13 of the Build Up Your Chess Beyond the Basics, number 2, he says, during the game, it is necessary to take into account only a few factors essential to the position. The art of evaluation actually consists of being able to filter out the essential factors in the position from all these numerous factors. The position of the king often plays a decisive role and can outweigh the other factors. Now, of course, that's obvious, and that's why I talk about piece activity, but the ability to filter out information, especially in the middle game, is a key factor of improving your chess. So I'd like you to look at this position and just think about what you'd play. Now, after I studied this Mikhail Tal game versus Spiridinov, I actually played this bullet game, and within 1 or 2 seconds, I immediately played in this position. Now, of course, I have an extra piece, but I played b4. Now, b4 makes perfect logical sense, even though it's not the first move of the computer. You can see that the computer wants to play a5 and then b4, but it's a little slow. But actually, after the moves b4, I'm threatening to just rip open the king side, or at least the queen side against the king, with b takes a. And then if the pawn takes, I play queen to b6, which I played right away. And then if he protects the pawn, I actually missed a tactic, which would have been rook takes. And now if the pawn takes, I get this awesome knight check, and I just win everything, in addition to ripping open the pawn cover against the king. But instead, I played a5, and after he took, I still get the same check with the knight. And now if the king goes here, then I get a discovered check, winning everything. And he actually just went over, and I got checkmate right away. So this is what I'm talking about in addition to using pawns to rip open lines for your pieces. So I want to clarify that there's 2 main things you need to think about in relation to pawns in the middle game. Pawns can either increase your piece activity, or pawns can hamper your piece activity. So that's really the main source of evaluating pawns in the middle game. Now let's get into the game between Mikhail Tal, and we'll go further into this idea. This is a game that was played in 1970 between Nicholas Spiridinov as white and Mikhail Tal as black, and it's really a perfect illustration of what I'm talking about. I guess you could say, sorry, Philidor, pawns ain't the soul of chess, but pieces are, and we'll see how Mikhail Tal uses that understanding, and we'll also see how he filters out, or how you can apply this knowledge to filter out the most important ideas in a middle game. All right, so knight to f3, we'll just get through these moves quickly with g6, d4, we're heading towards the king's Indian. All right. So after these moves with e4 and then castles, bishop to e2, we have the King's Indian orthodox variation with e5. Now it looks like white could just take that pawn, but that would actually be a tactical mistake. If he did d takes e, then after these moves, you just trade queens, and then black can hit back with knight takes e4. And now, of course, if the knight takes, then the bishop would just take. And if he goes to try to keep that pawn with knight takes f7, then actually bishop takes check wins a piece for black. And now he's left with an extra knight. All right, so of course you can figure that out over the board. It's just a very common thing you'll see in the King's Indian defense. All right, so developing the knight. Now the main problem for black is that he's a little cramped. You can see that white is kind of pushing into the 5th rank, whereas black is basically back on his own. So he doesn't really have as much sway in the center, but he uses his pieces on the side and eventually the f5 break to try to basically attack in the center and eventually go for a kingside attack. All right, so we see d5, and now Mikhail Tal just immediately occupies the center, and now he's threatening e4. We see queen to c2. And now here's exactly what I was talking about with a5 preventing b4. It just supports the piece that came to c5. So already we're seeing the ideas applied. So at this point in the game, we have white basically establishing a very strong and kind of locked off center, but black has some counter chances by eventually moving this knight and playing f5, and he also wants to just maintain his current piece activity, preventing white from using his pawns to chase pieces back. Now the main issue for black is the development of this light square bishop, because once he plays f5, the bishop doesn't really have anywhere to go, and he also needs it to control the light squares, which can become weak. All right, so let's keep going. So white could play something like just a developing move, bishop to e3, hitting the c5 knight, which you'd have to play b6 to bolster it. Instead, he makes a slight error with the knight back, knight to d2. So what would you play in this position? All right, so we know that piece activity is actually the soul of chess. It's the most important thing. And Tal immediately capitalizes on that by playing bishop to h6. I really like this move. Now white's plan is to play knight to b3, and he really wants to try to keep his dark square bishop because of this fianchetto structure. And Tal takes advantage of that. White plays knight to b3 anyway. He takes, and then after this exchange, he just moves the bishop back. So it's a slight strategic victory. Now he has the bishop pair, and he gets to keep the dark square bishop. All right, so again, the main issue is the development of the light square bishop. If black plays something like, bishop to g4, white can just take. Let's play the line here. So if he goes here, takes, then white can just chase back with h3. And now if black ever wants to play f5, then these light squares are a little bit weaker, and the white knights can eventually, look towards going to e6. Hopefully not, but it could happen. All right, so he doesn't go for that line. Instead, we just see the knight back. A very typical maneuver to just push the pawns and try to gain more space. And now, all these kind of strategic ideas of space and, pushing your pawns is directly related. Of course, you have to ask yourself deeply, why do you want more space in chess? Now, of course, you want more space because you can put your pieces behind that space or in front of that space and use it to control more squares. It's as simple as that. All right, so Spiridinov sees this idea of wanting to exchange the light square bishop, and he actually plays bishop to g4, going for that idea. f5, and now the bishop goes back. But notice that now the bishop is trying to control this diagonal, but he has literally 0 squares to move. And that actually hands over a slight advantage to black. All right, so the queen comes in, develops the rooks, and now Mikhail Tal is going to go for a kingside attack. He brings the knight back, f3. So this is actually a position that's good to know, because you'll get these kind of positions a lot in games where it seems like you could play a lot of moves. There's really no tactical variations to calculate. And you always need to remember the basics. Now, this is where kind of filtering out evaluations, filtering out information is so important and is one of the hardest things in chess. But really, we can summarize it. So you always want to focus on developing your pieces. Specifically, you want to connect your rooks by hopefully move 10 or 15. Now, in the King's Indian type structures, it's going to take a little longer. But in this position, Mikhail Tal doesn't forget the basics, and he wants to develop the rooks. So he could play bishop to d7, getting the bishop out of the way, finally connecting the rooks. Instead, he just plays rook to f7, obviously planning to eventually just double up rooks on the f-file. All right, so I played that a little quickly. The queens want to trade. We're having none of that. And now white tries to hit back with a half-hearted c5. Now, I say half-hearted because obviously white's pieces are all over on the king side, trying to prevent the black king side attack. And now c5, it doesn't really have any venom in it. Now, normally in the King's Indian, white will try to hit either in the center or on the opposite flank. But in this position, with all his pieces over on the opposite side, it doesn't really have any concrete threats, and it actually allows black to start hitting back now. We see suddenly just f takes, bishop takes, and now what do you think you should do here? The intermezzo move with e3, a big thorn on the center and the king side of white. So of course, because pawns are worth less than pieces, he has to move the queen. And now black wins kind of a pawn, but it's not so much about the pawn. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's about the reduction in the piece activity. So with this pawn here and the queen suddenly moving over to the queen side, it looks like white kind of had some ideas to eventually swing over his queen and protect the king side that way, so it's not so bad. But black actually has a +3 advantage, or I guess -3 advantage in this position, and that's wholly based on the pawn sitting here and the reduction in, I would say, these pieces here. All right, so let's keep going. The rook's double, he takes, and now a move back by the knight. So it's a logical idea to try to blockade this pawn with knight to e2, and I'd like you to stop and think here what you would do. Now, most players would try to hang on to this pawn and just try to, eventually win another pawn and maybe go for something like here. Just kind of ideas that just seem safe while retaining material. Not Mikhail Tal. Here he plays e2, giving away the pawn. Now, this is a perfect illustration of what I'm talking about, giving away pawns and increasing your piece activity. And this is why pawns are not the soul of chess, but pieces. So if either the rook or the knight takes, well, I guess if the knight takes, we already get bishop to e3 and kind of a vicious attack. So let's say the knight takes here, which was white's original plan. Then all of a sudden you see bishop, and now knight to g4. Now if either the queen or the pawn takes, you're going to get a quick checkmate. Now there is a little bit of defense with something like here. It's just really bad. Of course, he's already lost. All right, so let's keep going. So instead of the knight back, he should have just played h3 and understood that now he's defending and he has to use his pawns to control, especially the g4 square. Very important. But white underestimates the power of black's piece activity. So the rook takes, and now we see knight to g4 anyway. Of course, if the queen takes, and then it's going to be checkmate in 1. So white finally plays h3, trying to double up on the g4 square. And now the knight is occupying the square that the pawn did. And there's all kinds of threats, even like rook takes, knight takes. So after the rook goes there, we see b5. Now I really like this move because black is using b5 to deflect either a knight or a queen from this 4th rank here to eventually swing over. Now, objectively, white could have played queen to e4, which makes logical sense because now white's defending against all of black's pieces, and he really should bring his queen over. But we see queen takes. Now, I'm not trying to cover every variation in this game, but I just want to get the point across of being able to filter out, especially in the middle game, the understanding of what the function of pawns is. And you should really think of your pawns as ways to increase your own activity, which I guess you could say is getting more space, and also using it to decrease your opponent's activity. So playing moves like h3 to control g4 square, those are the kind of moves that practically you'll play a lot in your own games. All right, so we see the sudden sacrifice, rook takes, just breaking the pawn cover of white. And after queen takes, look at all these pieces. The queen's over here. I guess I like the phrase, the queen's in Siberia. I've been watching Power Play Chess by Daniel King, a great channel. But he talks about the queen being in Siberia, and that's a perfect example here. All right, so trying to bring pieces back over to the king side, but it's a little too late. Check, check. And now instead of e4, just the simple rook to f1 is actually a mate in 11. All right, so he does that because he wants to win a rook. Now, if the knight takes, we see rook to f1. And after a couple more moves, check. With bishop to f4 check, actually, white resigned. And we'll just go through some variations to finish it out. If the king, well, actually, if the king comes here, it's checkmate in 1 with the knight and the bishop covering those squares as well. And if the king goes anywhere, like here, it's checkmate. And if the king goes here, it's checkmate as well. So basically, black is going to end up with an extra pawn and an extra knight after takes, some checks. He would just take the knight, and white's going to get some spite checks, but black will be able to get out of it, and his extra material will win quite easily. All right, so a fascinating game. I'm going to cover the function of pawns in the endgame, because the function of pawns does change when you reach an endgame. But in the middle game, you need to focus on only using your pawns as kind of a sidekick to your pieces, where they'll either increase the activity or decrease your opponent's activity too. So you really should think about that. That's why I'm always talking about that, because that's a very simple way to understand and practically play chess. Instead of trying to get more and more information and more factors that you want to focus on, you should try to get less, and you should try to focus on what's only important. It's kind of the 80-20 rule of chess strategy. All right, thanks for watching, and I hope this video helped you in some way filter out your own evaluation, and I'll see you in the future.